for Acts 22 and Acts 23, so we have some ground to cover. So let's see where those set in the context of the book. This is our outline of the book, two major sections. And we are in that second section, the gospel to the uttermost parts of the world. And so in that second section, as we talk about the gospel to the uttermost parts of the world, we've had the first, second, and third missionary journeys. And we're now in Paul's trials and his journeys to Rome. He's going to Rome, and he's being given assurance, and will be given assurance again in our study today, that he's going to make it to Rome, and he's going to testify for the Lord before Caesar. And he's going to be able to do that. And so we'll see more about that as we go forward. All right, let's start with Acts chapter 22. Question number one is a summary of chapter 22, and that answer would be simply Paul's defense. You remember in chapter 20, if you were not here last time, chapter 21, as Paul had been arrested, and as they're ushering him off, he stands on the stairs, and he is given permission, he's asked permission to speak, and so that's what chapter 22 is his defense. In fact, he calls it his defense at verse 1, my brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now. And so as he's giving this defense, it's not merely a rebuttal of the false charges, but it gives him an opportunity to try to say something to reach some of the lost souls, not just some, but all the lost souls that are in his hearing. And so we see that he was asked if he could speak Greek, but he speaks to them in the Hebrew tongue. And we talked last time about how that speaking to them in the Hebrew tongue makes a connection to the people that he's speaking to. And so verse 2 and 3 make that point here in just a second. So here are two things that happen in chapter 22. Paul's speech before the people, his defense, is kind of abruptly cut off. And then we see the immediate effects of Paul's speech, and that leads us then to chapter 23. So let's talk about Paul's speech before the people. Three things happen here. He's going to tell them about his life before his conversion. Then he's going to tell them about his conversion. And then he's going to tell them that he was called to preach to the Gentiles. So those are the 3 points he makes in his speech. But when he mentions the Gentiles, that's what upsets them. They're already upset and agitated, but that's an opportunity for them to be even more agitated, and we'll see more about that toward the end of the speech. But let's start at verses 1 to 5. Here's his life before his conversion. He makes 2 points here about his life before his conversion. First of all, he was brought up in the strictness of the Jewish religion. That's in verses 1 to 3. Let's get that. I'm starting at verse 3 because we've already talked about his defense, and he's speaking to them in the Hebrew tongue, and they kept silent. Now he said, I am indeed a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, and city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God, as you all are this day. So what's his point? He is not merely interested in portraying, I want you to know my family history, I want you to know about me, I want you to know my education. He's not touting himself, he's not bragging about himself, but what he's doing is simply identifying that I am as strict, in fact, stricter than most of you are, or at least I was before my conversion. So I wasn't some radical Jew over here that really didn't hold to the law. I wasn't strict at all, and so I was easily swayed, but I was as strict as anyone. I was schooled at the feet of Gamaliel. He was one of the most revered rabbis of the day. I sat at the feet of Gamaliel. I learned the strictness of the law. And so he said, I was brought up in this very city, in Jerusalem, according to the strictness of your law. Here's how far I went. Look at verses 4 and 5. I persecuted Christians. I persecuted this way. Now that's one of about 5 passages that mention the way, like in Acts 9, Acts 19, Acts 22, and Acts 24. All of these passages call the way, the Christianity the way, because Jesus indeed is the way. But anyway, I persecuted the way to death, binding and delivering into prison both men and women. From that he was there, and he's going to tell us later about holding the coach for those who stoned Stephen. He voiced his opinion that he should be put to death. But more than that, there were others that he was responsible and had hands on as far as bringing about their death and their imprisonment. So it wasn't just an isolated case of his persecution. That's his point. So, and he said, the high priest can also bear witness. I'm going to paraphrase verse 5. You go ask the high priest, and he'll tell you, I had letters from the high priest to go to Damascus and arrest Christians and bring them to Jerusalem and put them on trial and punish them because we were so dead set against the way. So this is what I was before I was converted. I was very strict, as strict or maybe stricter than most of you are. And furthermore, I went to the point of I was going to kill Christians. That's what I was. Something happened. What happened? Well, beginning at verse 6, he talks about his conversion. Now, if you don't have marginal notes, we ought to know this from memory, but in case if you can't remember these passages, then maybe you want to make a marginal note here that there's 3 passages that talk about his conversion. Acts 9, just the whole chapter, and Acts 22, and Acts 26. Those are parallel accounts. There's going to be some information in Acts 9 that's not in the other 2. There's some information here that's not in the other 2, and some information in Acts 26 that's not in the other 2. So if I want to get a full picture, we're not going to go to Acts 9 or Acts 22 in detail. We'll make some cross-references in a couple of places. But the conversion story is told in those 3 chapters, Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26. We'll commit that to memory. So here's what he says. I was on the way to persecute Christians, beginning at verse 6 now. He talks about how the Lord appeared to him on the road to Damascus. And as I journeyed near Damascus, about noon, suddenly a great light from heaven shone around me. Acts 26:13 says it was brighter than the noonday sun. Not mentioned here, but Acts 26:13 says it was a light that was brighter. If you can imagine staring up, which you can't do very long, if you look straight up on a bright sunny day at the noonday sun, it would be blinding. It was brighter than that, according to Acts 26. He said he fell to the ground and he heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Now, I learned a very practical thing there. What's done to Christians, what's done to fellow man, is done ultimately to God. We see that in Matthew 25. What he was doing was, he was persecuting men and women, verse 4, but it was said that he was persecuting Christ. So if you mistreat fellow Christians, you're mistreating Christ. If you're good to fellow Christians, you're being good to Christ, according to our text here at verse 7. So he answered and he said, who are you? And he said, I am Jesus of whom you are persecuting. And so the Lord appears to him. Now, we see a little evidence later. Let's get ahead of ourselves to verse 15. The purpose for the Lord appearing to Saul was not to save him. We'll give evidence that he wasn't saved at this juncture. But the purpose of the Lord appearing to Saul was to make him a witness of the resurrection of Christ and qualify him to be an apostle, to send him to the Gentiles. Acts 26 even makes this clearer. And we'll get to Acts 26 a little bit later. So the Lord appeared to him on the road to Damascus. Now, at verse 9, he said, those who were with me saw the light, but, he said, and they were afraid, but they did not hear the voice of him who spoke to me. Now, let's look at a possible contradiction, or a supposed, not really a possible contradiction, but a supposed contradiction. Let's go back to Acts 9 and in verse 7. The men who journeyed with me stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no one. Acts 9 said they heard the voice, but here the text says they did not hear the voice of him that spoke to me. How do you harmonize? Well, the same way that you do in probably your household. One of your family members hollers from the other end of the house, and all you hear is, oh, and you say, wait, I can't hear you. Well, then why did you holler if you didn't hear them? You heard a voice, but it was not distinguishable. You couldn't tell what was said. And I think that's the harmony of the text. Did they hear the voice? Well, Acts 9, go back to Acts 9 if you've already left there. Acts 9 and verse 7 said they hearing a voice but seeing no one. They heard a voice. But this one said they didn't hear. So how do you harmonize that? The same way when somebody says something, you say, oh, I didn't hear you. Yeah, you heard them. You just couldn't tell what they were saying. You heard a noise, you heard a voice, you heard words, but they were not distinguishable. And I think that's the point here that they did not hear. So let's finish verse 10 and 11 to finish a subsection. Verse 10, and he said, what shall I do? And the Lord told him to go into Damascus, and he'll be told you all things that are appointed for you to do. Now, there's still something for him to do, and there's two things. One is what he's going to do to be saved, and the other is he's going to go to the Gentiles. But that's all going to be told to him when he gets into Damascus. Now, verse 11, He said, I couldn't see for the glory of the light. He was blinded for 3 days, according to Acts 9. So he is led by the hand, and he came into the city of Damascus. Now, was Paul saved on the road to Damascus? That's a very common thought in the religious world, who's saved on the road. If he was, we're going to get ahead of ourselves. He was the most miserable the saved man because he was blinded, and he didn't eat or drink for 3 days. So he's the most miserable new convert, number one. Number two, Ananias didn't know it because Ananias told him he needed the remission of sins in verse 16. There's no way that he was saved on the road to Damascus. That was not the purpose of the Lord appearing to him. Let's go further. Verses 12 to 16, Ananias came and preached to him, and two things happened. He restored his sight, verses 12 and 13. He miraculously restored his sight, which suggests to us that that was evidence that indeed the message that Ananias preaches is from the Lord. Whatever Ananias says to him, we know it's from the Lord, or Saul knew it was from the Lord, because he miraculously restored his sight. Now, that's verse 12 and 13. So he said, at the same hour, I looked at him. Now, that's interesting. Just a footnote on the nature of miracles. It was a sudden thing. At that same hour, he looked up and he saw him. It's not that his vision began to get a little better and it's kind of fuzzy, and 3 months later, it's getting a little clearer, and 3 months after that's a little clearer, and then finally, about 2 years later, he's got clear vision. But he suddenly looked up at him and he saw him. Now, beginning at verse 14 and 15, he told me that God chose me to go to the Gentiles. That's the purpose for him appearing to him. More details are given in Acts 26. And so verse 14, he said, the God of our fathers has chosen you that you should know his will and see the just one and hear the voice of his mouth. Now that's interesting. That'd make a sermon within itself. God wants you to know his will. He wants you to see the just one. He wanted you to see the Lord and hear the voice of his mouth. Now verse 15, this is a key verse to the chapter. For you will be his witness to all men, that includes Gentiles, of what you have seen and heard. Now we're going to see evidence a little bit later in this context, chapter 22. He wanted to work among the Jews, but God wanted him to go among the Gentiles, and he did the will of the Lord, even though he wanted to stay among the Jews and preach and work among his own people. Now, verse 16, let's stop and talk about verse 16 just for a moment. It's one of the more familiar verses. And he told him, and now why are you waiting? Now remember, Acts 9 says he was praying. If you want to go back and find that reference, go back to Acts 9 just for a moment. Acts 22 doesn't tell us that. But I want you to notice at verse 11, Acts 9 and verse 11, Ananias was told to go to Saul because, behold, he is praying. So here's a man who's praying, and he's told, why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. In other words, when you arise and you're baptized, you will be calling on the name of the Lord. So while he was praying, he was not calling on the name of the Lord. Now let's stop and talk about calling on the name of the Lord, and I want to quickly do this. We don't have time to develop the whole thought. But you might make a marginal note. This would be a good time to make a marginal note at verse 16, parallel accounts that define calling on the name of the Lord. Now, why do we need to define that? Most of our religious world has the concept that calling on the name of the Lord means praying for salvation. If you're a sinner, pray the sinner's prayer. And you pray and God will save you, and that's what calling on the name of the Lord. In fact, we're supposed to call on the name of the Lord. Well, let's start right here, and then we'll go to the other two. Right here, he said, why are you waiting? He's praying. And while he was doing that, he was tarrying or waiting. So what are you waiting on? What you need to do is arise and be baptized and wash your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. In other words, when you arise and are baptized, you will be calling on the name of the Lord. So what does calling on the name of the Lord mean? It simply means obedience to the Lord. You arise and you be baptized, you will be calling on the name of the Lord. Praying wasn't calling on the name of the Lord, but when you would arise and be baptized, he would be. All right, let's notice another text quickly. You probably have this noted from previous studies. Let's go to Acts chapter 2 and in verse 21. Acts 2:21, that whoever calls will be saved. This is one of the clearest passages of all, by the way. Whoever calls will be saved. Verse 47 says they were saved. Now get the picture here. If you call, you'll be saved. They were saved. So that means they called on the name of the Lord. What were they told to do and what did they do? They were told to hear, verse 22, To believe, verse 36. Repent and be baptized, verse 37. Verse 41 says they did that. If you call, you'll be saved. They were saved. That means they called. What'd they do? They heard, they believed, repented, and were baptized. They called on the name of the Lord. That context just defined for me what calling on the name of the Lord means. It just simply means obedience. Let's go to the third passage now, and that's in Romans 10 and in verse 16, or 13 rather. Romans 10 and verse 13, that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. This is a quotation from Joel 2. All of these passages are using the language of Joel 2. But now at verse 16, point is they didn't call, but he doesn't use the word call. He uses another word synonymous with calling. He said they have not all obeyed. You might circle the word obeyed at verse 16 and draw a line over to the word call at verse 13. They could call, but they didn't call. But he doesn't say they didn't call. He said they didn't obey, saying the same thing. So all is harmonized, showing me that calling on the name of the Lord means simply obedience to the gospel now. All right, let's move on to verses 17 through verse 21. He said, I was called to preach to the Gentiles. So here's my life before conversion. My conversion, I was called to go to the Gentiles. Now this gets a little more detailed here, and perhaps we're less familiar with this section because we spend a lot of time in verse 16. Let's go to 17 and 18 now. He said the Lord told him to get out of Jerusalem quickly. Now, we need to put a date to this and harmonize it with other passages like Acts 9, Galatians 1. I'm convinced, and I don't have time to perhaps all the details, but I think this perhaps is not talking about immediately after his conversion, but 3 years later when he went and spent 15 days in Jerusalem, according to Galatians 1, verses 18 to 24. And so check the PDF material if you've got that and download it, and you'll see some more information about that. I don't think this was immediately when he went to Jerusalem, but when he went to Jerusalem 3 years later. So when he goes to Jerusalem later, according to verse 17, that it happened that when I returned to Jerusalem, didn't say when here, but I think we have to harmonize that with Galatians 1, that he was praying and he fell in a trance, and the Lord told him to get out quickly, and I'm paraphrasing verse 18, because they won't receive your testimony. You need to get out of Jerusalem, they're not going to receive your testimony. Now this gets interesting because what Paul focuses on is that they know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believe on you, and when the blood of Stephen was shed, I was standing by consenting to his death and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Now, you're telling me they won't accept my testimony, but I've been a persecutor. You say, what's that about? Why does he bring that up? And so what he's saying is, in verse 19 and 20, this section right here, that they know how I persecuted Christians. His point is, they know I was sincere and they know I am sincere. So he's actually, I think, disagreeing. The Lord said, you need to get out. They won't accept you. And Paul is saying, I think they might accept me, because they should know that I'm sincere, because I was a persecutor of Christians, and I was sincere in doing that, and I've been converted, and that shows my sincerity now. Paul's wanting to stay among the Jews in Jerusalem and work among them. But, verse 21, but he said to me, depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles. In other words, Paul makes it clear that I went to the Gentiles because of the divine call. Not because that's what I wanted to do, but because that's what God told me to do. There's a principle about obedience. Sometimes I want to do this. Nothing wrong with doing that, but God wants me to do this over here instead. And I read that in his instructions, that I need to do what the Lord said despite what my feelings may be. I learned a very practical thing. So he's saying that I wanted to work among the Jews, but God told me to go among the Gentiles, and so I indeed went among the Gentiles. Now, when he mentions the Gentiles, his speech is kind of abruptly ended. So let's see what happens here. Three things. The mob begins to cry out, away with him, away with him. They want to do away with him. They tore their clothes and threw dust in the air. Well, that's a sign of rejection, apparently. But what the significance of tearing their clothes out of anger, perhaps? I can't really trace exactly. Some have suggested that for lack of having any stones to throw at him, or maybe being in trouble with the Romans if they threw stones at him, that consequently they just throw dust in the air, symbolic of or tearing their clothes or throwing their clothes in symbolism of that's what they want to see done to Paul. But anyways, a rejection of his speech. And away with him, and so they're tearing their clothes and throwing dust in the air, verses 22 and 23. This is interesting at verse 24 now. Pay attention to verse 24. The commander, remember we identified him earlier as Claudius Lysias. The commander ordered that he be brought into the barracks and that they should examine him under scourging, that he might know why they shouted against him. Now, what's a scourging? A scourging is basically taking a whip and beating them and basically laying open with pieces of metal or bone or stone in the leather strips as they beat them, and just keep beating him until finally he confesses. And so you put the pressure on, and finally under the pressure they'll confess what they've done. And so the commander says, I want him scourged until he confesses what this is all about. They're shouting out away with him. I want to know what this is all about. And so y'all go and do that. So Paul raised the question, is it unlawful to scourge, is it lawful to scourge a Roman being uncondemned? Look at verse 25. I'm a Roman, and you're going to scourge me being uncondemned. And when the centurion heard that, they backed away, and he told the commander, this man's a Roman. Now this is interesting because he comes and said, with a large sum of money, I became a Roman, apparently a bribe. That I bribed and paid somebody off to be a Roman. And what did you do? Paul said, I was born. I'm born Roman. In other words, I'm more of a Roman than you are. I'm more legally a Roman than you are. You talk about paying a large sum. I was born. And consequently, I'm a Roman. And that has to sting the commander. I want you to notice, in other words, he was a more honorable Roman. So notice at verse 29, they were about to examine him. They withdrew, and they were afraid because he was a Roman. Now, verse 30, to finish this chapter, they brought him before the Sanhedrin. So things are not going quite like they thought. It may not be going like Paul had thought it would go, but it's not really going like the enemies of Paul thought it would go. They abruptly ended his speech. You're about to scourge him, find out he's a Roman, and now they're going to have to do something else. So notice at verse 30, the next day, because they wanted to know for certain what he is accused of, they called the council to appear, and they brought Paul down and set him before them. So now he's before the Sanhedrin council. So now let's move on. I may come back to the practical things if time permits. Let's go to chapter 23. This is Paul before the Sanhedrin, and he was delivered to Caesarea. So we have Paul before the Sanhedrin. The Lord appeared to him at night. There was a plot to kill him that was revealed, and then Paul delivered to Caesarea so that he goes before Felix. So there's a lot here, but we can quickly run through this and I think get the gist. Verses 1 to 10. Paul's before the Sanhedrin. He starts on this note. He said, I've lived in all good conscience before God to this day. I've lived in all good conscience. There's several things I learned from that. I learned something about the conscience. It can clearly be wrong. But to us, that's a notable and honorable statement to say, I've lived in all good conscience. I've always done what I thought I should do. But that was an insult to this revered body among the Jews to say, I've always done what was right. As long as he was persecuting Christians, that's fine. But when he converted to Christianity to say, I did that in good conscience, that's an insult to them. And they're enraged about that. So the high priest said to strike him on the mouth. And so Ananias commanded him to be struck on his mouth, and Paul rebuked Ananias. And he called him a whitewashed wall. In other words, a hypocrite. You're whitewashed. In other words, whitewash covers what's underneath and hides that. And so consequently, you're a whitewashed wall. You're nothing but a hypocrite. Why would he call him a hypocrite? You're saying to judge me according to the law, and yet you are violating the law. What a hypocrite you are. And those that stood by rebuked Paul. They rebuked Paul for reviling the high priest at verses 4 and 5. Now, Paul corrected that. He said, I did not know he was a high priest. Ruler of your people. So Paul was admitting, if I'd have known he was a high priest. Now, why did he not know he was a high priest? He might not have seen who gave the order. In the mob, in the crowd, someone calls out, strike him on the mouth, and he might not have known that was the high priest that did that. That's one possibility. A second possibility is that he might not have known who, because he's been out of the circulation among the Jews for the last 25 years. Or some number of years anyway. And a third possibility was that the high priest might not have been in his high priest garb, and he might not have recognized him as being the high priest. For some reason, Paul did not recognize whoever gave the order to strike him on the mouth was the high priest. And he said, you're right, I shouldn't revile the high priest because, and he quotes from Exodus verse 5, that's Exodus 22 and verse 28, that you're not supposed to speak against the high priest. That took courage for Paul to admit, I shouldn't have done that if I'd have known that was the high priest. I didn't know that. And I shouldn't speak against the high priest. Now, beginning in verse 6, Paul states that he was condemned because of the hope of the resurrection. Now, this gets to the heart of what the book of Acts is about. So let's notice at verse 6. This is a key verse to the chapter. That he perceived that one part was Sadducees and the other were Pharisees. He cried out to the council and said, I'm a Pharisee. And what's he doing here? Well, if he says no more than to say I'm a Pharisee, he's just divided the crowd. When your enemy is against you, if you can show a division among your crowd or create a division among those who are against you, they start fighting each other and maybe no longer fighting against you. And that's exactly what the Jews, the Pharisees and the Sadducees had no use for one another, but their common enemy is Christianity. And so he said, I'm a Pharisee. And when he said that, the Pharisees come to his defense. And they're not really caring about Paul. What they're caring about is being a Pharisee. That's all they care about. But anyway, notice verse 6. He said, concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead, I'm being judged. Y'all want to know what this is about? You don't have to scourge me. You don't have to do anything else. You don't have to put me on trial. I'll tell you what this is all about. It's about preaching the resurrection of Christ. That's what it's all about. That's why I'm called in. That's why I'm called into judgment. That's why they're saying away with this man. Now, verses 7 and 8 shows that there was a dissension. Verses 7 through 10, there was a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They began to argue with one another because of their difference over the resurrection. Go to verse 8 with me. Go to verse 8. The Sadducees says there is no resurrection, no angel or spirit. There is no life beyond. But the Pharisees confess both. So they began, verses 9 and 10, to argue with one another. And the Pharisees came to his defense by saying, we find no fault with this man. Maybe a spirit, an angel has spoken to him. We don't want to fight against God. And there was such a dissension that the commander, Claudius Lysias, thought they were going to pull him apart so he rushes in and rescues Paul. Now, this is interesting. You say, why is it interesting? Because at Paul's defense, they don't let him get finished in chapter 22 till they're enraged away with him. And they're going to score. And he finds out he's a Roman. Well, we'll take him off to the Sanhedrin, get him over to the Sanhedrin, and they don't even have a fair hearing yet, or a reasonable hearing, until it's disrupted again, where they're about to tear him apart. And so Paul has to be rescued by the Claudius Lysias. And so now let's begin at verse 10. I'll come back to that here in just a moment. Claudius Lysias don't want him to be killed. He's trying to spare his life. So the Lord appeared to him at night, verse 11. Now this is an important, and make a cross-reference to chapter 19 and 21. Let's go back there and get that first, and then we'll come back to chapter 23. At verse 21, in Acts 19, when he was at Ephesus, when these things were accomplished, Paul purposed in his spirit that he would pass through Macedonia and Achaia to go to Jerusalem, and after that, he said, I must also see Rome. He had made plans. He had making his plans to go to Rome. According to Acts 19 and 21. Well, here the promise is made that he's going to go to Rome. And so the Lord appeared to Paul that night and told him to be of good cheer, Paul. That's the first point to be made. He's told him to be of good cheer. In other words, they're out to kill you. They were going to tear you apart, I recognize. They were going to scourge you, I recognize. But there's no reason for you to be afraid. Now, why do I not need to be afraid? Here's why. You may go through some trials and tribulation, but they're not going to kill you. Here's why. He said, For as you have testified before me in Jerusalem, you must also bear witness at Rome. So here's the promise and the assurance of you're going to go to Rome and you're going to testify there. So any threats they give to you, any trials you face, you're not going to die, you're not going to be killed, you're going to go to Rome. And that's going to be interesting because as we get into even like the shipwreck later, he has the assurance, I'm going to Rome. God told me I'm going to Rome. Now then, there was a plot against Paul's life revealed. There were 40 Jews. Now, because this council meeting, the Sanhedrin council, was disrupted prematurely, and it didn't go well for the Jews. And if you were on the side of the Jews who were wanting to kill Paul, this is not going well. This is not going too well. We've got him arrested, but we can't kill him yet. So notice beginning at verse 12. When it was day, the Jews band together. There was about 40 of them, according to verse 3, that said they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And here was their plan. They went to the chief priest and said, we've bound together, we made this pact, we're going to kill him. So what you do is you call the council member together, the council meeting together, get the Sanhedrin council together, and as you're taking him on the way tomorrow, we're going to, according to verse 16, we're going to ambush him and we're ready to kill him. So we vowed we're not going to eat or drink anything until we kill him. Well, they didn't kill him. You had to wonder. How many of them died of starvation? None of them. None of them. F.F. Bruce makes the observation that according to the Mishnah, there were exceptions that could be made, that if you made a vow that you would not eat or drink until a certain thing had been accomplished, that you were allowed not to fulfill it by reason of constraint. In other words, if you can't accomplish your goal, you can go back to eating again. As most hunger strikes go, so goes that. They're not going to eat anything till they kill him. And so they've plotted to do that. Now, beginning at verse 16, Paul's nephew, notice Paul's sister's son, his nephew. We don't know anything else about him. We don't know anything about Paul's sister. We don't know anything about this nephew other than what's mentioned here. There's no other reference to my knowledge in all the New Testament, unless there's something in some historical documents like Josephus. There's nothing in the text about any of his family. But he heard of that. Now let's get that, and I want to go back and talk about providence quickly before we wind up the story. Beginning at verse 16 now. He heard about the ambush, and he went in and he told Paul about that, and he he called a centurion over and said, take this man to the commander and let him hear what this young man is saying. And so the centurion took him, and again, in interest of time, I want to notice at verse 18, the commander was told that Paul, the prisoner, said, bring this man to you. And so he took the young man aside and told him, what have you got to tell me? And he said, well, here's what's going on. Verse 21, there are 40 men who said they're going to kill him. They won't eat or drink until they killed him. And so the commander said, you go and don't tell anybody what you revealed to me. Now let's stop there for a moment. This is obviously a case of providence. We get a peek into the providence of God. God said, I'm going to take you to Rome. And God's going to preserve him, but how does God do that? Well, God's all-knowing. God knows what he's doing. But one of the ways God works is through natural means. That's God's providence. And one of the ways in which he preserved his life was, it just so happened, the nephew overheard the plot, goes and tells Paul. Paul sends him to the commander. The commander then decides, we're going to get him out of here, and we're going to get protection for him and get him out and get him down to Caesarea, is what we're going to do. And so Paul's life is preserved. But we see, we get a peek into God's providence of how God did that. Now, I don't always know when I see something that I think is providence, but this is pretty sure this is providence because God had said, I'm not going to let anything happen to you. And part of how that was protected was the young man overhearing that and telling the story and getting that to the commander. Now let's go on to verse 23 to 25 to wind this up. We're about done. 23 to 25, Paul is delivered before Felix now, or taken to Felix. Now notice beginning at verse 23, the commander prepared protection for Paul to send him to Felix. There were 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen, 270 protectors. He sent him in the third hour of the night, about 9 p.m., and provide mounts, that is, animal for him to ride upon, and to bring him safely to Felix the governor. He was the governor of Judea. And so I'm sending him to Felix and get him out of here because they're trying to kill him. There's a plot to kill him. I want to get him out of here. But he sent a letter along. Now, this is interesting. This is typical of political figures. This is a letter from Claudius Lysias. And this is in verses 25 to 30. A letter from Claudius Lysias to Felix. He sent along with Paul. Here's why I'm sending him to you. It's not what he said, it's what he didn't say. Let's get the picture. He said, Claudius Lysias, the most excellent governor Felix. He said, this man was seized by the Jews and was about to kill him. And coming with troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. He paints himself in a very favorable light, doesn't he? That, boy, if it hadn't been for me, I'll tell you what, they would have killed him. He failed to mention that he was the one that had ordered him to be scourged. He didn't mention that. Most politicians don't tell everything. They paint themselves in a favorable light, and so he does too. He doesn't mention, you know what, I almost scourged a Roman. I almost did that. In fact, I gave the command, and if he hadn't said he was Roman, I would have beat a Roman. And we'd all been in trouble. But no, he didn't mention that. And so he said, I ran in and I rescued him. If it hadn't been for me, this man would have been torn to shreds. And he said, I wanted to know the reason why which they accused him, and I brought him before the council, and it has something to do with their question and their law, but I found nothing worthy of death, so I sent him to you, and his accusers will come, and they'll state the charges before you. So basically his letter was, thanks to me, he's still alive, and thanks to me, I didn't let the Jews do something unlawful, and I sent him to you. His accusers will come, but it's got something to do with their law. I can't find any reason for death among him. So now, verse 31 to 35, to finish the chapter. The soldiers brought him, and they brought him to Antipatris at verse 31, which is Jerusalem and Caesarea. And they spent the night there, and the horsemen left them, and the next day they left the horsemen, rather, to go on with Paul, and the soldiers turned back, and they delivered him in the letter. But the governor said to him, that when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from, and he said, from Cilicia. And he said, I'll hear you concerning your accusers. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. Now that's interesting. It seems that Paul is being given some degree of respect. As he's going to be, when he gets to Rome, he's going to be housed in his own house, and he's not in a dungeon of a prison like he is in 2 Timothy. And we come to 2 Timothy a little bit later. But this is Herod's palace that had been used as the king and now is being used as the governor's official residence. M.R. Vincent suggests that Paul was evidently dealt with, he was dealt with leniently dealt with and not cast into the common prison. So he wasn't treated as just a common prisoner and cast into the dungeon of a prison, but he's given some leniency and some degree of respect. And so he's allowed to dwell in Herod's praetorium. Now, chapter 24, next time we'll get into him before Felix. And our time is gone, so we'll forego the rest of our questions.